Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
And here's Dr. Gary Ostrower, a longtime history professor at Alfred University. Dr. Ostrower, thanks for joining us by phone this morning.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
Well, Dr. Ostrower, you just heard in our newscast that Senator Franken this morning is blaming former Senator Al Franken, I should say, is blaming Senator Chuck Schumer. And this follows news that Associated Press has. Democrat presidential candidate Kirsten Gillibrand says that she does not regret calling for Al Franken's resignation from the Senate and that female senators are being blamed for it in a way that their male colleagues are not. And Franken says he absolutely regrets resigning. And he also gave an interview to the New Yorker, and the New York Daily News picked up on it, as have a lot of other media outlets. And Al Franken saying that Schumer would not let Franken give his side of the story. And Franken said that. And Franken is saying that the picture was shown and Schumer would not allow Franken, to give his side of the story, and gave Schumer gave Franken an ultimatum to get out now. Your thoughts on this breaking news, Dr. Ostrower?
Well, I heard the lead-in during the newscast, and you had mentioned that George Soros, somehow, I don't know exactly why George Soros is being brought into all of this.
Well, he's given statements on it, and his supporters have been complaining about Kirsten Gillibrand running for president for that reason, for driving Franken out.
But the information comes from a very, very detailed and a very, very good article by a reporter named Jane Mayer. Jane Mayer is one of our very, very top political reporters. She writes for The New Yorker. She's written a number of books about politics. She interviewed Franken. She interviewed many, many of those people who were involved in the departure of Franklin. That includes, of course, Kirsten Gillibrand, Senator Gillibrand from New York State. To say that Senator Schumer is, quote, responsible is partly true. But it's not the entire story. There are a lot of people who are involved in the in the departure of Franken. And what I thought was so interesting about the Mayer article, as I say, it's a long article, so there's a lot of detail there. And if you want to subject yourself to a reasonably long article, I think it's about 12 pages or so in the magazine. It's extremely informative. It tells you a lot about American politics. It tells you a lot about the Me Too movement. But one of the things we learned is that much of this came from a report by a woman whose name was Twomey, I think, or Twomey, and she herself is very conservative. She's often been on Fox News. She's considered a friend by Sean Hannity. So, this thing gets a little bit more complex than it might otherwise appear on the surface. And the report by this woman who claimed to have been abused by Franken turns out to be, in many ways, simply wrong. Some of it is flatly wrong. She was not honest in some of what she said. It's a much more complicated story than she had made it appear. But in either case, the way in which it was perceived by Senator Gillibrand, and not only by Gillibrand, but by a number of other senators, both Democrats and Republicans, is that Franken had engage in, quote, sexual assault or sexual harassment. It turns out to be much less the case than it appeared at first blush. But the fact of the matter is that the reality is less important than what people believe to be. That
perception is bigger than reality. In this case, you believe, Dr. Ostrower?
Well, what I think is that, Franken certainly acted inappropriately, but not half as inappropriately as had been made out at the time. And not just not as half, but also the complexity of the situation as it was originally reported. Some of the original reports from the woman who claimed, the first accuser of Franken, much of what she said was simply untrue. Much of what she said was simply either exaggerated or it was untrue. But in either case, Gillibrand and then a number of other United States senators, particularly female senators, Democrats, demanded that that he leave the Senate, that he resign. And at that point, Franken, unsure about what he wanted to do, unsure about what he should be doing, called for an investigation. And the investigation would have been an investigation by the Senate Ethics Committee. This is normally the way these things are handled. The problem is that the Senate Ethics Committee acts relatively slow. It has not been very effective in previous situations and so forth. And so Senator Gillibrand and others were unwilling to allow the Senate Ethics Committee to take over this issue.
And I think the reason for that was that the hearing was coming up on the Supreme Court justice. His name, the one who was accused of sexual harassment himself. His name slips my mind at the moment.
Kavanaugh.
Yes, Brett Kavanaugh.
Yeah, well, that was going to be a little bit later. But where Schumer comes into this, and where I think this is kind of interesting, is that Franken asked Schumer, he requested of Schumer an investigation. Schumer refused to permit that investigation, and more importantly, Schumer effectively refused to allow Franken to state his own case, to plead his own case, to tell people exactly his side of the story. Or to put it differently, what Schumer did was to deny Franken what Franken would call due process, and at that point, it was, more or less over. And what Schumer had effectively said, if I'm not mistaken, is that if you don't resign by this evening, by this particular evening, that Schumer was going to take this issue to the entire Democratic caucus, that is to say, to all the Democrats in the Senate, and have them put on record some kind of a resolution or some kind of a statement demanding that Franken resign. And so Franken resigned. He really had no choice. One of the observers said, he had as much choice as a person jumping off a plank, when he's being when he's being executed. Franken he resigned, and today many of those Democrats who had demanded his resignation in the first place are now regretting it. They are now having second thoughts. And, one can argue that there's a kind of mob rule here. I mean, you see it, on the Republican side in respect to the so-called squad, send these people back home or lock her up. And now you see it on the Democratic side. I think it's really, really important that when these kinds of charges are made, that we not automatically assume that the accuser is correct and that the accused is guilty as charged. I think we ought to step back, take a deep breath, and find out what the facts really are.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower, as we always do on a Tuesday. Dr. Ostrower, any thoughts on the news being reported this morning on the Boris Johnson victory?
No surprise there. I think that when we spoke just last week on this program, we had said that, the likelihood was, probably 70% likelihood, 75% likelihood, that Johnson was going to become the next British Prime Minister. 160,000 members of the Conservative Party, out of a total British population of 70 million, selected Johnson to become the next Prime Minister. And so we're going to have to deal with him. He ran on a program of a hard Brexit. In other words, that Britain would leave the European Union, and they would leave. I can't remember whether it was October 1st or by October 31st, without any conditions whatsoever. And he appears to be hell bent to do exactly that. My hunch, and history is going to prove me right or wrong. It's going to prove Johnson right or wrong. That it's going to be a very, very messy affair. I think that the British economy is going to suffer some chaotic moments. Whether that will, kind of ripple out and affect Europe generally, or the United States even, remains to be seen. But the whole argument for Brexit, when the election was held 2 years ago, was not spelled out very honestly to the British public. It's an example, I suppose, of how the public can be misled. The public, by a very narrow vote, supported in Great Britain the referendum to leave the European Union, and now the British are going to have to deal with the consequences. And the consequences, as I say, may be pretty severe. There are already quite a number of British firms in Great Britain who have made the decision to leave Britain and to relocate into Frankfurt, into Brussels, into Antwerp, and into Amsterdam. And as I said, the British are going to have to pick up the pieces after all this is done. The other thing I would want to mention about Johnson is that, he has a reputation for being very fast and loose with the truth. He says a lot of things that are not true, similar to, someone on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. And he was once even fired by the London Times for making up quotations, faking quotations, in an article that he had written when he was a reporter for the London Times. How much this is going to affect him as Prime Minister remains to be seen. But I don't think that from our perspective, from this side of the Atlantic, I don't think that the signs are all that favorable.
He, Boris Johnson, inherits a pretty intense situation with Iran.
Well, he's going to have to deal with that. At this point, there's a very, very tense situation between Great Britain and Iran. The British stopped an Iranian tanker that it claimed was carrying fuel to Syria in violation of sanctions, of international sanctions. In response, the Iranians have taken over a British tanker that was going through the Straits of Hormuz just within the last few days. The British have said there are going to be serious consequences. What those serious consequences are going to be remains to be seen. How the United States is going to either back up Britain or not back up Britain in this remains to be seen. All bets are off, other than to say that it's a tense situation and things can get out of hand, even unintentionally out of hand.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower, what did you make of the news out of Iran of the 17 I don't want to say alleged, but Iran says they arrested 17 CIA spies. And Trump came out and said it's fake news. I didn't understand. The president didn't clarify what he meant when he said it's fake news, that they weren't arrested, that they were not CIA agents. I don't know what to make of that story.
I think that Iranian truthfulness, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the worst and 10 being the best, is about 2. But by the same token, I think that President Trump's truthfulness, remember, he's a guy who has told either false or misleading statements 11,000 times since he was inaugurated. I mean, it's a stunning number. It just kind of freezes you. It numbs you. His credibility on that same scale is about a 1. Maybe it's a 2. And consequently, I don't know who to believe. I have no idea whether these people were genuinely spies or not. I think that the Iranian government, I don't trust the Iranian government for a moment. By the same token, when Trump says that things are fake news that are anything but fake news, we can't take him seriously. And so I think we're going to have to rely on more independent sources of information, whether those independent sources come from magazines like Foreign Policy or very credible newspapers like the New York Times. We're going to have to be a little bit patient, and unfortunately we may not have a lot of time to be patient when it comes to the deterioration of relationships between the United States and Iran on one hand, and certainly the Britain and Iran on the other.
We've got This Day in History coming up in just a couple of minutes here on the Newsmaker Show. As always on a Tuesday, our guest is Dr. Gary Ostrower.
Hey everyone, Ken here. For 2 years now, you've heard Carrie and I use metaphors to test to see if you think your home or your business could use a revenue shot in the backside. Today, because of our new website, I can be a little bit more direct. Income Store has 2 doors. If you have more time than money, you're going to live under door number 1. You're going to see over 400 digital assets, 5 to 20 minutes apiece, that'll teach you how to manage numbers and lead people, or show you 6 growth tips you've never heard of. All of this so you can start growing your home or your business revenue literally immediately. If you have more money than time, door number 2 is going to be for you. You can view some of our managed services. Look for more done-for-you packages. 34% of Americans in 2018 visited one of our managed services. Forbes 3 years in a row quoted, Income Store is an expert at generating home or business revenue. If you'd love to explore how to check out adding revenue to your home or business, just go to incomestore.com. That's incomestore.com.
Checking in now with meteorologist Rob Carolyn, who says we've got a couple of nice days in store.
We do, and I reply to Brian O'Neill, whose name in the UK is Boris Johnson. Yes, we've got some very nice weather headed our way. We've got some cloudiness out there this morning, Brian. It's in response to an upper-level disturbance that stretches over the top of us back into Michigan. But the surface, we've got high pressure moving in, so looks like a pretty decent day develops. It'll become partly sunny across the southern tier. It's going to be very comfortable temperatures today, about 75 to 80. Humidity levels are going to be low. So all in all, for late July, we're doing pretty well. Sunrise this morning was at 5:55 a.m. It'll set tonight at 8:39 p.m. We've got clear to partly cloudy weather tonight. You'll be able to sleep with the windows open, turn that air conditioning off. Lows tonight, 55 to 60. Tomorrow, we'll have partial sun. We're warming up to 75 to 80 yet again tomorrow afternoon. Tomorrow night, we're clear to partly cloudy, comfortable, 55 to 60. Beautiful day on Thursday, lots of sun, 75 to 80. And right now, Brian, it looks like the sunshine continues into the upcoming weekend.
Thank you, meteorologist Rob Carolyn. Now back to Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, you wanted to say something about a climate report.
Yeah, there's a new climate report, a fairly new climate report, that is out by an organization of scientists. It's a non-political organization called Climate Central, and it shows that, and this is fact, this is not a matter of interpretation, that 4 of the hottest years, I should say not 4, but 5 of the hottest years have been the previous 5 years, 2014 through 2018. And it shows not only that they are, hot years, but that things are getting hotter and hotter. Last year, 2018, was the 4th hottest year. I'm talking about globally, the 4th hottest year in climate history. So when you hear people say that climate change is a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese government, I hope you don't take that very seriously. There is a consensus, and I mean a consensus by maybe 98% of all the serious scientists involved in this area, accepting the reality of climate change, of global warming. And the other point I would want to make, and we're not going to have a chance to talk about it right now, is that this is going to have a huge economic effect, and that economic effect may destabilize central banks in Europe, certainly the Federal Reserve in the United States and elsewhere. In other words, we are looking at problems that we're simply not taking seriously enough right now. And perhaps, Brian, we can talk about that at another time.
Sure thing. This day in history, July 23rd, 1914, and I'm reading from the History Channel's website, Austria-Hungary issues ultimatum to Serbia. At 6 o'clock on the evening of July 23rd, 1914, a month after the assassination of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife by a young Serbian national. Sorry about the pause, pop-up box there. Gary, you take it from there.
Well, a Serbian nationalist, an extreme nationalist, had assassinated the Austrian Archduke. The Archduke was like the second in command. Austria had an emperor by the name of Francis Joseph, but he was an elderly man. His son was the Archduke, and the Archduke would have become the next emperor. Unfortunately for the Archduke, he was assassinated. His wife was assassinated, and the Austrians used that as an opportunity. They used that as a way of crushing Serbian opposition to Austria in the Balkans, in the Balkans and Eastern Europe. In other words, the Austrians were looking for an opportunity to take Serbia on, and this really offered it. Whether or not the Austrians had anything to do with the group that assassinated the Archduke, we really don't know. Probably not. But the fact of the matter is that the Austrians then issued an ultimatum, and the ultimatum to the Serbs was that within 1 week, either you meet the terms of this ultimatum, or we're going to go to war. And so, it really meant that, in 7 days, a good possibility then that Europe would be plunged into war. More importantly, the ultimatum was structured in a way that the Serbs could not agree to it. They just couldn't agree to it. For instance, the Serbs had already launched an investigation into the assassination. And what the Austrians are saying is that we're not going to take your investigation seriously. We are going to conduct the investigation. And the Serbs knew, of course, that Austrian investigation could not possibly be a fair investigation. So, there could be no settlement here. And by the end of the week, of course, the Austrians launched World War I on August 1st of 1914. The Austrians attacked Serbia, knowing full well that Serbia was allied to Russia. What the Austrians hoped was that they could crush Serbia, that they could defeat Serbia before the Russians could mobilize. And unfortunately for the Austrians, I should say, the Russians did mobilize in sufficient time. They entered the war, and we all know what happened. Namely, about 11 million men died during the First World War, and many, many civilians, of course, died during the war. It was a catastrophe, one of the great catastrophes of the 20th century.
Down to 60 seconds, Dr. Ostrower. Your thoughts on President Wilson in World War I?
Well, Wilson had claimed at the beginning of the war, that is to say when the war began in Europe in 1914, that the United States would remain neutral. And these are his words, neutral in thought as well as in deed. And in the real world, that's impossible. Of course you're not going to be neutral in thought. People of English background favored England. People of Irish background who were anti-English tended to favor Germany and what were called the Central Powers. And so, Wilson was playing something of a difficult game, trying to remain neutral and yet not really being able to remain neutral. In addition to which, the U.S. had a lot of aid. And I shouldn't say aid, but they really had a lot of trade that was headed toward Europe. The Germans, during that period, in order to crush the English, sunk many of those American ships. They also sunk some English ships carrying American passengers, like the Lusitania. 2.5 years, I shouldn't say 2.5 years, but about 2 years after the Lusitania was sunk, the United States finally entered the war. Should the U.S. have entered the war? That remains, I think, a difficult question even to this day. But I can certainly tell you that Woodrow Wilson did not do enough to maintain American neutrality in a way that ultimately made American entry in 1917 much more likely than it otherwise would have been.
Going through old photo albums, Dr. Ostrower, I can find pictures of great uncles and a grandfather in World War I, so that's always very interesting to hear. Dr. Ostrower, we're out of time, but thank you as always for joining us.
Thank you very much for asking me to join you today.
You're not going to read about this in the drive-by meeting.